The East has some pretty extreme history, but European history is interesting for sure.
There's something about white males where they're more inclined to take a risk. That's like you have Asians tend to have higher IQs than whites, but you have all these inventions. You have all these inventions coming from whites, despite not being the smartest ones. And I think it's a combination of like gumption and grit and risk taking, and it just leads to more inventions. Well,
I think it was. I know that you probably know.
Chinese
E. Michael Jones, for instance, right?
Yeah.
Well, E. Michael Jones has a hypothesis about this, which is kind of interesting. So, white cultures themselves are kind of young, right? They're actually kind of young. The European nations were basically all barbarians, and that's what the Romans called them, barbarians, because they went blah blah blah, right? That's why they called them barbarians. Yeah, that's why the Romans and the Greeks called them barbarians. Blah blah blah. That's what they thought they sounded like. Thought they sounded like idiots, and they lived in forests, the European forests, basically. Yeah. Once there was a move through to kind of culture the barbarians, they had all this natural resource around them. Massive forests. Some of these trees were, you never find anything like it. Again, all of Europe was a giant forest. So they had huge industry. They were able to kind of move into huge industry because they had a lot of resources. And so kind of the Jones hypothesis on this is Africans are way behind because they didn't have all of this access to resource for industry. There's just really nothing there in sub-Saharan Africa. Whereas in Europe, when the barbarian tribes which were there get domesticated, they had tons and tons of resources, and so they became very inventive.
But isn't the whole hypothesis about race and IQ that people in Africa had it easier? So they didn't have to survive, whereas whites had to survive the Siberian winters, and they got better at systems because they had to like pickle things and plan for the winter and insulate a home and have firewood for the winter months, but no one else really had to plan that far ahead.
So that's, if we're looking from kind of a purely evolutionary lens, which is what you're kind of looking at. Not really. That wouldn't really be the hypothesis because they also weren't getting run down by lions and tigers, and they also weren't, having nearly as much trouble.
Well, blacks can run fast.
So because of whites, right? But yes, Africa had all sorts of conditions that they were dealing with there that were every bit as bad as the conditions dealt with by these northern tribes, right? Same thing. They had all sorts of bad conditions, but they didn't have nearly as much in the way of naturalized resources which were useful. They had those things that nobody cared about then, right? If you're tribal, like gold and diamonds and rubies, right? Nobody gave a fuck about those things.
Those are rocks.
Yeah, those are dumb glittery rocks. We can't eat that. You know what I mean?
Well, why do you? Because I don't think it's arguable that whites are, especially males, are exceptionally good at systems. And why do you think that is?
Well, I think it's because Christianity.
Oh, really?
Yeah. I agree with the Jones hypothesis that. So, well, the interesting thing about Christianity is you can take this kind of cross ethnos. You can say, yeah, the Scottish are a lot like the Irish. They're not Irish. And they're not English. And the English and the Scottish and the Irish have fought a lot of wars against each other.
Yeah.
They've done it tons and tons and tons.
600 years.
Yeah, but they have this great unification, right, that happened throughout all of Europe called Christianity. And there was a synergistic relationship between the church and the state. Well, the church itself, it had churches that it was the head of in all of these different countries, in England and in France. And it was all the Catholic Church, one church under one head. So it was really easy to communicate between these different nations for diplomacy, things like this. So systems gradually expanded from that.
The farm. Due to the vast differences in Scandinavian topography, it is difficult to generalize when discussing the way in which men wrested a living from the land. In the far north and along Norway's western seaboard, survival was dependent on a combination of fishing, hunting, and the ownership of sufficient pasture land on which to graze livestock. As a consequence, most farmsteads were remote and scattered. Far pasture were in Denmark and southern Sweden, however, both arable land and rich plentiful, and archaeological evidence shows that in those areas, a large number of farms, both great and small, thrived throughout the Viking Age. In some instances, smaller holdings were grouped together by common interest and operated in the form of collectives and villages. The farming year began in the spring when plowing and sowing took place. In its most primitive form, plowing involved the use of the aard, a pointed length of timber usually tipped with iron, which the farmer or thrall guided through the earth while following behind one or two draft animals. In the late summer, the whole household, using short scythes and sickles, harvested their crops, which would have included barley, oats, rye, and, in the more southerly regions, wheat. During the summer, cattle, sheep, and goats were grazed on higher pastures in order to preserve the lower meadows, which yielded the fodder so critical to the survival of cattle and horses throughout the winter months ahead. Before the onset of winter, any weak or infirm animals were slaughtered for meat, which would be preserved by drying, salting, or smoking. Their skins would then be tanned and used to manufacture clothing and footwear. During the harshest weather, horses and cattle were sheltered in stables and byres, but goats and sheep were generally expected to survive outdoors. Although the majority of Viking farms, whether isolated or communal, were run on self-sufficient lines, a crucial part of the farmer's economic well-being was always dependent on having a healthy surplus of marketable goods, such as livestock, grain, milk products, and wool, which he could sell at his local town.